Hey everyone, welcome to First Impressions, a panel about title screens. This is basically going to be a compilation of dozens of examples of the most creative, subversive, and exceptional title screens we could find, with a bit of history and pseudo-academic categorization to string everything together. Press any key to continue? Which one's the any key? So, to give a quick introduction, I'm Sebastian Snowberger, possibly better known by my pen name Darvo Prower.
And I'm Keith, the ghost of MAGFest. So Darvo and I have been coming to MAGFest for around 10 years now, and we've been hosting Mages panels for the last 5 or so. And we really like to gather unique and strange either mechanics or concepts within games, catalog them, and then kind of cram them into an arbitrary categorical framework with a basic thesis statement so that we can present them to a crowd while maintaining some form of academic integrity. So basically, this is just, as Darvo said, going to be a showcase of some very unique, novel title screens throughout games.
Yep, and if you like this, I've been Let's Playing on and off for some 13 years. I have a Twitter account that I use a little too frequently, and I have my Discord info. That'll all be up again at the end if you're interested after you see what we have to offer. And I think Keith has some plugs.
No, I'm the ghost of MAGFest, and ghosts don't have anything to plug besides Undeath, I guess. So we can go ahead and proceed. Before we jump into anything, just a quick spoiler warning for everybody. Pretty much all the games on this list are going to be spoiled in some capacity. So take a second to review this. Some will be minor, some will be major. Either way, you've been warned, so please don't sue or cancel us. This is your fair warning.
And also to mention, some of the older title screens really were big on the flashing lights. We've tried to keep those videos small to minimize any photosensitivity risk, but that's going to be there. Let me know if anything needs to be shut off or anything. Just a heads up. Hopefully it won't come up.
Okay, so now that we've gotten the basic introductory stuff out of the way, we're going to take a quick look at just a basic overview of what we're going to be covering in the panel. We're going to start by clarifying what we're counting as title screens for the sake of our examples. Obviously, title screen in the context of games can be a little bit nebulous and can be kind of a gray in terms of its definition. So we'll offer just a basic heuristic for how we're going to be categorizing those. We're then going to give a very brief, quote-unquote, complete history of title screens, which really just boils down to us taking a look at some arcade title screens versus their home console comparisons and examining the context of title screens both in the arcade and in the home console context. And then we'll give an overview of the categorical framework, which we've sort of shoved these examples into to give you an understanding of what those categories will comprise. We're then going to move into all of our examples. And when we close out, hopefully we'll have some time for honorable mentions. We definitely want to have some time to give you guys the opportunity to tell us anything that you think is a super novel title screen that we may have missed. There's so many examples. We had to trim a bunch down just to fit this in, so hopefully we'll be able to get to that. And if you haven't figured out the arbitrary Wetrix background information here, neither have we.
All right, so a quick overview of what we're counting as title screens for these purposes. Oh, there's an animated background that you can't see because of the contrast issue. Oh, well. So we're going to look at literal boot screens. So obviously the game title itself, but also any developer publisher credits that are mandatory to view ahead of time. Any auto-playing cutscenes, demos, or attract modes that are going to play without any input from the player. And finally, just any menus that generally will show up between starting the game and actually starting. We have a question there?
We can lower the lights if you want to raise the contrast on that.
Oh, if you can lower the lights, that'd be great. Yeah, that's what we were trying. For like 20 minutes before this, we were trying to figure out the lighting situation, and there's this arcane like touch panel there with a password.
It's like you need to be a forerunner to activate it.
Yeah, it's like an escape the room segment or something.
All right, but
We'll continue while that goes on.
Yep. So the birthplace of video game title screens, where they really made themselves unique from just movies, opening credits, and all that, would be arcades. And one element very ubiquitous.
Oh yeah, bring it down again. Bring it down again. It was nice down there.
All right. Well, a ubiquitous element of arcade title screens is the high score screen.
That's good.
Thank you.
Sure, if you want to turn it off, feel free. Thank you. Sweet.
Awesome.
All right.
But yeah, this was basically a way to get the target audience to continue engaging with the arcade games that they were already really good at. because you get your initials on the screen there. Arcades also have the obvious incentive of grabbing people's attention with what are known as attract screens. This is not necessarily the greatest example of one, but this is Clax. So the first time you boot the game, you just get the logo, very simple there, and then if it's allowed to like run for some 10 minutes without any player input, it'll make these weird rectangular spirals and borders on the side to, I guess, try to draw in people who may have passed it over initially. At this era, home consoles were pretty dramatically underpowered, even compared to these early arcade machines. Early example of that, and probably the worst photosensitivity thing here, is Dimension X. No shade to Steve Hales. If I figured out how to make the TV do this and it wasn't commonplace at the time, I'd be pretty stoked about it. But that's just an example of some of the very basic state of title screens as they were being established as a common element in a lot of games. But an example of a really effective attract mode, and also when console games started catching up with their arcade counterparts, would have to be...
Yeah, Daytona. So everybody probably knows this one. This is a classic Sega arcade racing game. Left-hand side, you can see the arcade attract mode title screen, where you have a whole ton of information. You have the developer logos, insert coins, you have a credit counter. The screen eventually changes to include, as you see on the right, the high scores, some additional instructional information, alongside just what you're basically being shown, which is a representation of the gameplay itself. So on the right-hand side, you have the Sega Saturn conversion of the Daytona USA arcade game. And as you can note, even though it looks a little bit worse due to the graphical fidelity, it's essentially the exact same title screen. Which is interesting since, you know, for the home market, you obviously already have Daytona USA for Sega Saturn to be playing it. You don't really need the attract mode elements there to draw you in. You already have it booted up and you're going to play it. So you do lose out on some of that additional utility that the title screen and the attract mode provide within the arcade context. But there's definitely some value and certainly some novelty to maintaining a one-to-one conversion of even those types of assets and elements within games when porting from the arcade to the home market. But that's not to infer that, title screens are only unique or specific to arcade games and their home console ports. Obviously, as the home console market grew and grew throughout the 80s and 90s, that meant more home console games which were designed specifically for home consoles were coming about, which obviously also meant more title screens designed specifically for those experiences. More games in the passage of time naturally led to more game platforms coming about. And we even see the game console hardware itself start to include boot screens, little title crawls and logos, even simple menus that boot up prior to loading into an actual game, which will allow you to, at the highest level, maybe change some console settings or game-specific settings, or at the lowest level, just assure you that the console has successfully booted up. So obviously technological advancements in recent years allow for things like quick system booting, the suspension of games and immediate resumption of games. You can just put the system to sleep and boot up right back into wherever you were in God of War or whatever. So we see a lot more minimal title screens these days. Some games even sort of forego them entirely. But hopefully that's going to make the examples that we have here today stand out that much more, and we're going to highlight those as best as we can for you.
Yep. And one of the earliest really interesting home console games title screens we found was Ghostbusters for the Atari 8-bit. It might not be that impressive by modern standards, but there's actually like a lot behind the scenes getting that sprite of the Ghostbusters logo looking that good. I think it's made up of like 4 different enemy sprites, and they're doing something weird with the electron scanning to get that level of pixel depth. But the best part of this title screen would be the Ghostbusters sing-along to this MIDI, which is pretty impressive that they were able to sync this up back with what they were working with. And if you were a Ghostbusters head back in the 80s, this was definitely something really cool to show off when you bought the tie-in game. And you could do a much better job with the title screen like this than the actual gameplay, which, while this still looks pretty good for the era, it definitely leaves a lot more to the imagination compared to that recreation of the logo. As you can see, the Slimer looks a little different. And then something pretty shameless I just wanted to point out. They use the same... They just copied their sprite for Dan Aykroyd for Rick Moranis. You can't do that.
All right, so now we'll just give a quick overview of the categories which we're going to be using to categorize these games. Just a quick preamble. There's so many examples of title screens that do interesting or impressive things purely with their aesthetic or visual design. But TV and movies can do that too. So we're going to try to primarily focus on title screens in games that are unique or notable by the element of the fact that they're within a video game context. So the first category we had was reflective. This is going to account for any games, title screens that change to reflect either the game's state or your progress in the game, or otherwise reflect some sort of content within the game itself. We then have interactive title screens, which specifically gamify the title screen experience or add some kind of unique Easter egg or mechanic that requires player input on the title screen. We have meta examples, which we're using to refer to any games that are self-referential to their title screen or that have a title screen which is self-aware of the fact that it is a title screen, as well as any title screens that emulate other forms of media or other mediums entirely. And again, these categories are pretty much arbitrary. There may be some contradictions here and there. Please don't hold us to that if so. We'll be examining the intersections of these categories as well, culminating in sort of the Triforce midpoint there, which account for title screens that we feel accurately reflect all of these categories cohesively.
Yep. So to start off, we're going to go through some simple examples of title screens that change to reflect the status of the game. A really simple and iconic example of this is Yoshi's Island, which once you hit World 6, the title screen changes from a zoomed out view of the whole island at day to a zoomed in of the area where Bowser's castle is, and that takes place at night, which just reflects the darker themes of the later levels. More interesting example from a Mario game is Super Mario RPG. We were both surprised by this while doing the research, and the panel on the right here is the changed version of the title screen, but that's represented in the box art. It's like very iconically burned into my memory, and I never realized the very first time you boot the game, you're going to see this one on the left, because in the game, the giant sword Exor hasn't dropped into Bowser's castle yet, so it's left as like a surprise that's then immediately updated. But of course, the fact that happens as basically the first event in the story, like as soon as you save it, you go back to the title screen. Every other time you boot it up, you're going to see that second one.
So next we've got Undertale, and Undertale does a couple of different things with its title screen. As you play through the game and start to befriend different characters and do little sort of subquests with them, those characters will actually start to be reflected on the title screen as you progress. And you can also hear this kind of single, very basic one-track leitmotif theme that's playing in the background here. Well, as you progress and more characters start appearing, additional audio tracks actually start layering into that musical theme that's present on the screen. And eventually this all culminates in one really large final end title screen where you have all these different characters present, and the theme has evolved to be this bombastic, multi-instrumental kind of track. So this is an interesting example of how, again, a game's title screen can reflect both your progress in the game and changes in the game's state, while also hammering down and reinforcing the game's musical themes.
Right, and another example in this category is Spec Ops the Line. This, at first glance, appears to be the run-of-the-mill realistic military shooter that was quite popular in 2012 and still is today. This is a edgier one with an upside-down American flag and this sniper character who's doing different things as you progress through the main story. As you keep going through the story, it gets darker and darker and eventually becomes clear it's like a satire and criticism of this genre and the political undertones of it. Eventually you have this sniper character completely he's making a fire to stay the night. The flag is getting more and more tattered, and eventually he dies and birds are picking at his corpse. And then at the end of the game, when you bomb the city in the background, the title screen is completely desaturated, and you see the devastation that your actions in the game caused.
So next up, we've got Simpsons Hit and Run. Basically, Crazy Taxi meets The Simpsons. This game does somewhat more of a novel reflective change on its title screen, reflecting not only a change in the game state or the game content, but in actual real time. So the game will check the system clock, and then on certain holidays, it'll update to reflect that holiday with appropriate imagery, namely for things like Halloween, Thanksgiving, as you can see here, and then eventually Christmas as well. So we see these types of time-specific reflective title screens a lot more these days in the context of, say, MMOs, online games that can be continually updated to change their splash screens or title screens whenever needed. But anytime we come across an example like this in an offline sense, it's that much more novel for the time period.
Yep. And a very ubiquitous example of using real world time to affect the title screen is Animal Crossing. The original Animal Crossing actually just has this pre-made town with a effectively demo gameplay showing off what the characters can do. But this isn't actually your town in the game. It does still provide seasonal changes. It lets you know when you hit the months where it snows or where the leaves turn colors. But starting with Wild World, the rest of the series actually focuses in on one of your animal villagers and shows your actual town, which gives you a little preview of anything that's happened in your very own version of the game, rather than just demoing abstractly what the game is like. And this is also interactive in the sense that it's your town, so you could very much change the tone of the game by planting a bunch of pitfalls, which were one of the few items that villagers could interact with in this entry, and turn it into sort of this frog humiliation scene, and you get to see them sulk as as it's prompting you to start the game. And then bringing this forward to our final category of meta title screens. A very literal meta title screen is in the original Animal Crossing, which has a working NES emulator as a furniture item. And you can see the Super Mario Brothers title screen, as well as the title screens for any other games in the that were included in this emulation. So let's see, going forward, yeah, we're moving on to interactive title screens that have mini games, Easter eggs, or other things that you can see by interacting with the game. Try to figure out the best way to do the slide advance. I think it's just the arrow key. Oop. Okay, so one of the most famous title screens of all time is an example of this. You get to hear Mario talk for the first time unless you watch the Super Show, played Mario Teaches Typing 2, happened to run into Martinet in the con circuit, like in the 4 years when he got hired on before this came out, or you watch the fantastic 1993 film.
Oh, God.
Also, you can stretch out Mario's nose and stuff. But yeah, this is a famous example of just a little thing you can do to mess around. It also shows off the N64's hardware. Like, this is the first 3D mainline Mario game, and it's really proving that you can like mess with these polygons and rotate them all in real time. It was a lot of fun to play with, and I'm sure a technical marvel as it came out.
Yeah, that said, I'm glad Mario's face doesn't actually look like this in the game.
Another example of a new Nintendo system demoing the functionality of that system is WarioWare Touch. This time, rather than pressing the start button on the system, you have to tap the start button that's rendered in game, and you have all these weird mustache creatures jumping around. If you tap them, they just jump out of the way, but that means eventually they'll cover up the start button, as you see here, and then just other things you can play with. You get added into the menu. Sorry. And the most interesting of those little things that gets added in is that star that had the rainbow trail behind it. Yeah, there we go. You could actually use the stylus to draw animated doodle with that, which was a lot of fun to mess around with when that was like my first experience with touchscreen technology. Nintendo just really likes doing this kind of thing on their flagship titles. So Pikmin 2, if you press the shoulder button, it makes the Pikmin rearrange out of the logo into Nintendo. You can spawn in enemies like the Bulborb and the Glint Beetle, and the Pikmin react to that the same way they would in-game.
You can control them, too.
Yeah,
those
they
little
use tank
enemies.
controls with the C-stick, and actually, the Bulborb, you can control its behavior of eating Pikmin, and this is a modded version where the Pikmin's reaction has gone away to really demonstrate how dramatic of an impact this can have on the title. So it's just eating them all with no resistance, and eventually you're left with this bleak, quiet title screen.
Nothing left except these two. They made it somehow. There they go. Wonderful. They can repopulate.
It only takes one Pikmin to repopulate.
So now we've got Mario Paint. This is a really sort of more of a toy box kind of title screen. It's very fun. It's very charming. Basically, Mario Paint is sort of like a creative tool / game on the Super Nintendo, which uses a mouse input controller. So on the title screen here, you can actually click on any of the letters in this title with the mouse, and they all have different effects. Some of them are just cutesy, like that one will change Mario's size. You can click the A letter to have it fall. And if you time the click of that right, it'll fall on Mario's head. Some of them will just paint little backgrounds that you can observe, sort of reflecting the creative elements of the game. One of them plays the credits. So there's all these cute little things that you can do with this title screen, and it sort of it acts almost as a soft introduction to the game's mechanics, to what the game is actually going to be playing like for the most part. While it softly eases you into that in this clever and friendly way. And so that transitions us nicely into our next category here, where we're going to look at some games that are that include title screens, which are reflective and interactive at the same time.
So they're interactive and they're representing what the actual gameplay is like.
Right. So the first of these is Rhythm Heaven, and this is kind of a subtle one. In order to actually get past the title screen in Rhythm Heaven, you need to flick that little orb in a very specific way. The game kind of really wants you to learn its specialized method of flicking on the DS touchscreen, since that's going to be used very heavily in the actual gameplay. So this acts as sort of a very, very light, basic tutorial right on the title screen.
All in the wrist.
Just in order for you to even get into the game and actually start, you need to essentially master this very basic action, which is somewhat unorthodox compared to other movements on the DS.
Yep, and another example in this category, Super Mario Maker, which itself has lots of references to Mario Paint, one of which is it has the same general idea of the letters of the title being interactable. You can also play this level in the background using the Wii remote with the gamepad controlling the touch screen. The interesting thing about this is, I think at the beginning it actually shows that you have the option to just immediately start making a level. It'll take you into the editor without having to go through the regular menus, and you can edit this pre-made level. And once you've made some levels of your own, they'll start showing up here as well. So it updates to reflect the actual engagement you've had with the main game.
A much more in-depth version of this same concept is in Scribblenauts and in Super Scribblenauts, as shown here. So both of these games open with a title screen that is essentially just a sandbox for the game itself. It's basically an action puzzle game on the DS in which you can type in different words and adjectives and such, and spawn in and modify items just by using the vocabulary built into the game. So with this title screen being in a sandbox mode, effectively, anytime you come back to the game to play more of its main storyline, complete missions and such, you can sort of mess around in this title screen first if you either just want to get that basic Scribblenauts gameplay itch out of the way, or if you want to kind of experiment with what you've learned while playing the game before moving into the next missions presented to you by the game. Next, we've got Fighting Hero. This is an unlicensed fighting game on the Famicom. So this is an interesting example in that it takes the game's combat mechanics and incorporates them into your actual menu UI manipulation. The problem here is that the game doesn't really play very well. So just to pick a stage here, it's kind of a struggle. It's an interesting example in that it's an early instance of this type of practice of combining the main gameplay experience with just regular menu manipulation. But it doesn't really work so well, just given the jankiness and poor performance of the game itself. A better example of the same kind of thing would be in Super Mario Sunshine on the GameCube, which takes, again, the same sort of 3D movement from the game and applies it to your title screen and main menu here. Even in this context, you can still see a bit of jank, as is obvious here. The menu doesn't actually let you leave until you've made a selection with Mario, which can be a little bit awkward given that they've taken the 3D gameplay movement and sort of squished it down into a 2D plane. But it's still a novel example of how developers can find ways to combine sort of their main gameplay experience with the experience of moving through a menu. And it is fun as well, given that you get a basic introduction to how Mario is going to control for the rest of the game, albeit in a 2D plane.
And a very minimalistic way of combining the title screen with the gameplay is Braid, which has used the arrow keys to move instead of the traditional press start to play, and the title just disappears from the screen you first load into. And they're a bit hard to see on the projector, but there are stars in the background there, which hint at the collectible stars that are well hidden in the game. And as you collect those corresponding stars in the constellation will light up, tracking your progress. Another example that almost inverts the way that Braid did it right there is Journey, which starts without a title screen, and it does have a press X to play prompt. And when you do so, you're just dumped right on in. You get like textless visuals of the controller telling you how to move after a little cutscene. And once you make your way to the only real focal point in this map, you're rewarded with... Come on. There And the rest of the game is very self-directed as well, so this is giving you a hint at what you have in store.
There's the actual title drop.
And lest you think that this is just an artistic flair indie games like to do, AAA games have adapted this, as Keith mentioned earlier. God of War 2018 has a very minimalistic menu at the start due to the fact that title screens that are super in-depth are more or less technologically obsolete when you can just resuspend the game from any point. But you have the menu just fade away into this cutscene, which eventually becomes a prompt to do a little action. That's like right around there. And then it's an interactive cutscene to just the full gameplay.
Right, and this is all seamless, so none of this is pre-rendered. You're being dropped into basically a small scene before an immediate tutorial, before it immediately transitions right into the main gameplay.
Yep. And this is actually an interesting contrast to the original God of War title screen, which just looked like this. It had the same effect as zooming out on Kratos, but it didn't transition into gameplay. It just cut to a cutscene, and it's an interesting little note that they preserved that element where Kratos is right there in front of you. And moving on to meta title screens, again, we're using this to both cover title screens that are self-referential to the fact they're title screens in a game in some sense, or ones that are intentionally recontextualizing the game through aesthetically referencing other media. So a very iconic example of this is Super Mario 3. The developers have even mentioned that it's like framed as if it's a stage show with a curtain rising and the heavy drop shadow behind the title itself. Something interesting about this I had never really noticed until looking at the video for this presentation is that once the copyright and game options load in, you have these Koopas that actually walk in front of it, which really hammer this home. Even though they don't have the dramatic drop shadow, they're in the background on the stage. And this actually hints at the in-game element that you can drop behind various scenery objects and find hidden exits and secret items.
Another example of this same kind of thing is in Desert Demolition, starring Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote on the Genesis. So this is off the heels of Super Mario Bros. 3, which obviously is emulating a stage play. Here we're instead emulating a real-world existing cartoon, an actual license. They make a perfect recreation of this Looney Tunes opening, even complete with the Looney Tunes theme song. And then they do this mock-up introduction of a standard Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoon, including the name drops with their quote-unquote scientific names, and that just blends right into the basic title screen where you can start the game from there. Next, we've got Dragon Ball Shenron no Nazo, or Mystery of Shenron. This is a Famicom exclusive game in Japan about the Dragon Ball license. Note the actual depicted Shenron dragon on the title screen there. So this is just basically a little action platformer game that emulates, I believe, the first season of the Dragon Ball anime, or the first portion of the manga. Your goal is to collect the 7 Dragon Balls, and then eventually at the end of the game, you do collect the balls, you summon the dragon, and as you may know from Dragon Ball, you're then given the option to make a wish. So Shenron asks you what it is that you want to wish for. This being Dragon Ball, some of the options are actually pretty raunchy. Going from the bottom up, you can wish for a Puff Puff massage, which if any of you have played any Dragon Quest games, you'll be well familiar with what that is. You can wish for a pair of panties. You can wish for the game to continue, to just keep playing the game. Or at the very top there, you can wish to have the dragon on the title screen start to move. And this is basically the last thing you can get in the game. You're just given the chance to make a wish. And if you choose that first option, from then on, Shenron is animated on the title screen. So there's tons of games where, when you beat them or get to a certain point, there's some kind of reflective change on the title screen. This is the only one I can really think of where it's opt-in, where the game sort of explicitly asks you, hey, would you like us to have this animate on the title screen moving forward? And they only ask it at the end of the game, so it's like really only good for replays.
I actually know this old classic that has a similar mechanic.
Yeah, and that's Dragon Power on the NES, so this may look a little bit familiar. Note that there's no dragon on this title screen, despite it being called Dragon Power. As it turns out, Dragon Power is actually just an English localization, or perhaps bastardization, of Shenron no Nazo, where they remove the actual Dragon Ball licensing and IP, but they keep pretty much the same character designs. So this game does the same exact thing. They present you with the option to make a couple of wishes. They've replaced the raunchy ones. Instead of asking for a Puff Puff massage, you can get hamburger. Instead of asking for panties, you can say, I want her sandwich. You can obviously also continue the game, and like in the original version, you can wish for the dragon on the title screen to move, even though this version doesn't have a dragon on the title screen. But ask and ye shall receive, leave it to Bandai, and they will make it happen. So you make that wish, and just as in the original, Shenron appears, this time clipping through the logo, since they didn't really account for the fact that they changed that. But again, just a very, very interesting, kind of funny example of a way that you can sort of opt in to have a title screen change in a reflective fashion. Oh, sorry, was there a hand up? Or?
I think he's actually wrapping around like spiral.
Yeah, and it shows better in the original version, but he kind of clips just a little bit in the Dragon Power adaptation. Can you rewind this one?
Yeah.
So here we have, this is the last of our Dragon Ball examples, I promise. We have Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22. Named as such because the game starts off with a baked-in roster of 22 playable fighters. You can pick any of those 22. But as it turns out, as in most good fighting games, there's a couple of Easter eggs and secrets, a couple of hidden characters. There's 5 hidden characters altogether. And if you play through the game and unlock all 5 of those characters, that brings the roster up to a total of 27. And that is reflected on the title screen in a very novel way, where they completely changed the name of the game. So now instead of Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22, it's Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 27. I can't think of any other games that have their name change upon completion, and especially in the context of a fighting game where presumably anybody in the FGC who would, for whatever reason, still be playing a PS1 Dragon Ball Z fighting game. It makes me wonder how people must colloquially refer to this, because it essentially has 2 different names after completion, which is pretty interesting. Next up, we've got Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. This is a PS4 adventure game where you're basically exploring an apocalypse after the fact. So you're coming across notes and recordings that are left behind by those who experienced this apocalyptic event in real time. The title screen gives you what looks like just basic options and functions, voiceover, subtitles, which you would think nothing of. As soon as you read those words, you know what that means. But the flavor text that accompanies those little menu options is actually kind of themed. So for voiceover, you have, this information is available in a number of different languages. Make sure that all of your family members can understand all of the emergency procedures. And for subtitles, for some survivors, speech and verbal instructions may be difficult to follow when under duress. Written instructions can always be requested. So even though, most people probably just see what the basic one-word summation of the option that's being presented to you is and go off of that, if you pay attention and read the flavor text, you realize the menu is actually kind of themed to reflect the actual narrative of the game, that being, this apocalyptic event. And it even sort of echoes some World War II or wartime propaganda safety PSA type posters with this in case of emergency flyer that you see here.
And our final example of purely aesthetic meta examples is LSD Dream Emulator, or as you might conclude from this, in linking the Sapient Dream. Now, as you might conclude from the name, this is a pretty trippy game, and the opening credits here, or they're not even really credits, it's just sort of the letters LSD showing up at all these weird little animations, but they're very clearly a psychedelic experimental film art style. I can't really think of too many games or really any forms of video that look quite like this. Just keep playing for a bit. Eventually you'll see that initial explanation of the initialism in linking the Sapient Dream show up again, but if you wait just a little bit longer, you actually get more coming in with in Limbo, the Silent Dream; in Life, the Sensuous Dream; in Lunacy, the Savage Dream; in Laughter, the Spiritual Dream; in Leisure, the Sonorous Dream. And this ties it to just the game's literal stated purpose of emulating dreams, and the title itself is up to interpretation. Even the developers don't say what the definitive meaning is.
So next we're going to take a look at some title screens that are both meta and reflective in our context here. Starting off with Seaman. So this is a favorite of mine. This is an abstract virtual pet sim from the Dreamcast, narrated, as you can hear, by the late, great Leonard Nimoy.
You a phenomenon like no other.
So this game kind of lampoons nature documentaries and instructional videos, at least on the title screen, where Nimoy will deliver initially this big exposition dump, kind of filling you in on Seaman, what the purpose of the game is, what you're here for, what you're going to be doing. And then after that initial boot up, every time you boot the game from then on, Leonard Nimoy will greet you and offer you just a quick status update on how your Seaman is doing and what steps you should maybe take throughout the rest of that day. So you have the option throughout any of these points to sit there and listen to Nimoy's dialogue when he's giving you these updates. But you can also just hit A to skip through them and get right into the gameplay if you want to. And Nimoy is going to make sure to let you know in a passive-aggressive way that he is not a fan of you doing that. A little further back. Yeah, like right there.
Hello.
I think we have 2 more of this.
Hello. Hello.
There are multiple coughs.
There's one more, just one more. This one's the best
Hello.
one.
Oh, well.
He's just given up at that point. Moving on, we've got Superhot. So this is our first example of sort of a title screen within a title screen. You boot up Superhot if you're playing it on PC, on your PC. But the game actually boots into this mock PC interface, complete with a curved CRT monitor sort of overlay. The bulk of the game's actual narrative takes place within this kind of mock PC setup. And then the first-person shooter Superhot gameplay, which you are probably familiar with, is framed as an executable file that you launch within this kind of mock PC environment. So again, this is sort of one of the first examples that we have of a title screen within a title screen. And it's kind of novel just by virtue of kind of interlaying itself within that context.
It was really worth upping the contrast for that one. Another example where you're seeing a fictional computer screen is Inscription. The general story of this game is that a card collector finds this floppy disk buried in the woods, and it has this weird game adaptation of a card game on it. And the interesting thing about that, which I'll go back to really emphasize it, you have your standard options there, but the new game, this is when you first boot up the game, is grayed out, and whenever you try to click on it, there's a distortion effect. Without spoiling too much, there's an entity inside the game that took control of it and physically removed the new game button from here to force you to continue into this altered version of the game, and actually getting that new game button is the goal of the first act of the game. Another example from a game came out last year, Binding of Isaac Repentance. We have to actually go back and start with Binding of Isaac, the Flash game from 2011. When you 100% this, you get the title screen upgraded to show you that you're a golden god for 100%ing a game, which curiously is a reference to an Adam Sandler movie. In the first DLC for that, Binding of Isaac Wrath of the Lamb, that 100% is upgraded to 110%, and the game suggests now stop playing, and your golden god status is upgraded to platinum god. In the remake, Binding of Isaac Rebirth, that's upgraded to real platinum god with an extra 1% to reflect the new content added for that, reminding you to stop playing, and this is reflected in the remake's new file select screen. Now, the first DLC for that just traditionally ups it to 1,001% and says nerd times a million. But when the second DLC for Rebirth comes out, something interesting happens when you 100% it. Your file select is replaced with this cryptic message to save files to go with a dead child depicted underneath it. And for those unfamiliar with the game, this is like probably 200 or 300 hours minimum to 100% it at this point. But if you do go through with the second file, you get both of them changed to this one save file to go image, and then finally you get the skeletons dancing, and across all 3 files you're rewarded with 3,000,000%. And finally, with the release last year, Binding of Isaac Repentance, there's a return of the stop playing, and when you've done the same thing, completed all 3 save files, you get this giant infinity made out of a lot of the different enemies in the game. So when they inevitably go back on saying this is the last version of the game, I'll be curious to see how they upgrade this from infinity %.
So next we got Final Fantasy 15, a Final Fantasy game for fans and for first-timers. Every single Final Fantasy has this little splash art logo, which is designed by Yoshitaka Amano, designer for the series. And the titles for the games are always paired with these logos. Each one has its own bespoke logo with that nice sort of appealing art style. So Final Fantasy 15, when you finish the game, that splash art is actually updated to incorporate Noctis, the main character. It's sort of in a thematic and relevant way to the ending of the game, which I won't go too much into here. The point being, this is, I believe, the only example of all the mainline Final Fantasy games where the splash art logo is actually updated after the fact, based on some sort of choice or decision made in the game. So it's novel within the context of its own series, and it's another example of one of these games where a change on the title screen can be reflective of some important or meaningful point within the narrative. Another example from a Square Enix property, we've got Bravely Default Where the Fairy Flies. In Japan, this is called the Bravely Default Flying Fairy. So it's a JRPG that is sort of trapped. It sort of takes the original Final Fantasy gameplay and tries to kind of convert it into something original, something new, while maintaining some of those original Final Fantasy trappings. And throughout, you have this little fairy character named Aerie, who she's friendly, she helps support the party, she follows you around. Later in the game, eagle-eyed players might notice on the title screen that after a certain chapter, the subtitle of the game actually changes in real time to read Aerie Lies instead of Where the Fairy Flies. So that's sort of a hint that this party member you have, Aerie, might actually be up to some no good. And in Japan, this same exact change occurs with the subtitle Flying Fairy. The F and F are removed to change it to Lying Aerie, which in and of itself has its own double meaning, since again, Bravely Default is kind of growing out of original Final Fantasy trappings into its own kind of standalone series. So the removal of the letters FF from the subtitle kind of hint at and emphasize that point a little bit more. Beyond that, we have Bravely Second End Layer. So this one's going to be a little bit tricky to explain. This takes the original Bravely Default twist, turns it on its head, and then suplexes it. So here, again, it's a JRPG. We're seeing the characters fighting the final boss here, and the final boss figures out that there is a player controlling the game. So instead of killing the party, the final boss just boots out to the title screen and tries to forcibly delete all of your save files to prevent you from actually defeating them. So before the boss can actually do that, and again, this is not player controlled, this is just happening automatically, one of the characters from the game will cut through and will reveal the title screen, notably pointing out that there's been a change in the subtitle, just like in Bravely Default. Here, instead of letters being removed from the subtitle, letters are added to change the subtitle from end layer to send player, essentially hinting that not only the final boss is aware of the player's existence, but the party of characters is aware as well, and they're attempting to enlist the actual player's assistance in defeating the boss. So with the addition of these letters to the subtitle, they're actually then removed, and the S and the P are converted into SP, which is a mechanic in the game, I believe it's called second points. And essentially you're taking those letters, converting them into SP, and sending them back into the game so that the main party can properly defeat the final boss. So this is really trippy. I mean, it's obviously playing with the title of the game, it's playing off of that previous twist in Bravely Default, but it's also finding a way to utilize the title screen in both a narrative and a mechanical sense. So I can't really think of many other examples quite like this. It's really definitely one of the most interesting ones we've got, I think.
Yep. Moving on to meta and interactive title screens. Starting off with a personal favorite. This isn't really all that novel in terms of the way it's interactive. It just has standard menu controls. But for those unfamiliar, Brutal Legend is a open world. Really, it has too many genres. It starts off sort of like a Zelda game, but then you get demon wings and start doing really weird RTS.
Just keep walking, real casual.
You play as Eddie Riggs, who's sort of a self-inserted Jack Black with a lot of voice dialogue. But the actual intro to the game, you just get this live action footage of Jack Black taking you into the record store. And he's talking about how there's this weird record that he found here that has magical power inside of it.
Here don't know where it came from, of course.
When he actually finds that, he'll... There we go.
You sure you're ready for this? Because what I hold in my hand is not just going to blow your mind. It's going to blow your soul. Go ahead. Open it. If you dare.
So you have your record itself being the title screen with stickers or content warnings on it, giving your main press start and downloadable content available. And whenever you do interact with this, you get more live action footage. If you don't press anything, Jack Black starts asking you why you aren't checking it out, gestures at it, and when you do finally start interacting with it, you get this really cool heavy metal album art type stuff, and it's all done with these slightly sped up stop motion-esque animations. It's really fun just to mess around with, and then you see the lyric sheet, the record itself for some of the different options. So yeah, it's not like there's any mini games here in the interactive sense, but you're controlling live action video in a way that the Sega CD could only dream of.
So now we've got Katamari Damashi. This is sort of a basic example. It's a third-person, I guess, roll-em-up title from the PS2. This game has a simple and novel save and load system where you're dropped in with the actual sort of twin stick gameplay control that you're going to be using throughout the rest of the game. And you're charged with either loading a save file or starting a new game by actually rolling into the Namco logo and picking pieces up from it. So this is another way similar to some of the examples we mentioned previously where developers can find ways to integrate the actual core gameplay into the just basic manipulation of menus, and even in such an arbitrary way as this. And it also just breaks the fourth wall by having you pretty much obliterate the Namco logo depending on which save file you're loading. Another similar example is Vectorman on the Genesis. So with this logo crawl, you're dropped in as Vectorman and you're given the opportunity to run around, figure out the controls, shoot and jump around and just feel things out. You can shoot the Sega logo and turn it off. Unless you do anything crazy here, it's just going to load into the regular main menu. But there's actually a secret here where if you jump into the Sega logo, I think it's 12 times, and then you shoot it a certain number of times following doing that, you're actually going to activate this hidden sort of Easter egg of sorts, which rains down letters from the Sega logo, and you have to try to catch as many as you can. Depending on how many you get total, you're actually going to be warped to different chapters in the game. So this acts as sort of like a hidden stage select. That you can only access by interacting and sort of really obliterating the actual Sega logo at the start of the game. So there's maybe some interesting implications there, but it's just another novel example of how right at the start of a game you can have these fascinating feature sets hidden away behind these meta interactive elements. Next up, we've got Takashi no Chosanjo, Takashi's Challenge. Many of you have probably heard of this. It's a relatively infamous Famicom game, which was designed by Beat Takashi Kitano, who's a known Japanese entertainer, director, filmmaker, kind of like a Renaissance man of sorts. Beat Takashi is known for sort of hating video games and computers and anything electronic. He's been on the record as saying computers are just kind of stupid. But he decided to direct a game here. And what we got out of that was this kind of this funny and eclectic game that sort of lampoons video games overall in a very cruel way. So on the title screen here, you have the option to punch. You have a button that's just dedicated to punching. You can start or continue, or you can punch. And if you push the punch button 20,000 times total in one sitting, you're going to be warped right to the end of the game, and you can just walk to the left, pick up the final treasure, and you get the ending. Which, knowing this game is not much of an ending at all. I think Beat Takeshi is really just laughing at everybody who gets to this point, either naturally by playing the game or by sitting there and pushing a button 20,000 times. It's hard to tell which one's funnier, honestly.
And finally, we have the Triforce, meta-reflective and interactive title screens. These really have it all. Starting off, we have Surgeon Simulator, which is a funny and grotesque game where you operate on patients, have to remove and replace their organs without making them bleed out. And the way you do so is by directly controlling the different fingers and hand of the surgeon. And the title screen perfectly recreates this interface with the caveat that rather than doing surgery, you're just at your desk. You can eject the floppy disk from the computer that's giving you your basic controls. You can put in other floppy disks to go to secret levels or access different menu options. And then your actual main level select is stylized as a medical report clipboard. So it has a little bit of everything we've been talking about.
Moving on, we've got Psychonauts, the cult classic game. It's an action-adventure platformer where you play as Rasputin, or Raz, who's this psychic Esper kid who's enrolled at a day camp for psychics. So this is an interesting one in that the title screen is actually portraying what you do narratively in the game. You dive into people's minds and sort of see visual portrayals of their psyche, their fears, their traumas. But notably, you're also just running around on this stylized menu and on the Psychonauts logo itself, sort of directly interacting with that. As if this wasn't enough, the game also has this little secret Easter egg where if you sit on the title screen for long enough, it'll start playing the game's credits, showing the development team and the production staff. And if you sit through this without pressing start and just wait, let all the title credits pass by, eventually, similar to in Brutal Legend, the game is going to ask, why, what are you doing? Why aren't you pressing start and just going through it? So this is an already very, very meta and interesting title screen that, also similar to some of our previous examples, introduces you to the basic gameplay. You're controlling Rasputin, jumping around, just as you would in the game, but in this very meta and also narratively important sense. We also have Detroit Become Human. This one's going to be a little bit difficult to explain. Detroit Become Human is a near-future sci-fi satire narrative adventure game that's a mouthful, that focuses on a series of androids and their place within human society in the near future. So the title screen features an android who's portrayed in the game named Chloe.
Hello.
And I'll just
Welcome to
turn
the
some of this up.
Detroit Experience. I'm an android and I'll be your hostess. Before we begin, let's make some adjustments to optimize your experience. These language settings were detected on your console. Are they correct?
So she makes sort of breaks the fourth
If you
wall
find the game
constantly.
too
We'll refer to
easy
your
or too
direct game
difficult,
settings.
Remember,
She
you can change
tutorializes
the
a bit. We'll
difficulty
tell you about
settings
different
in the
difficulty options.
section.
She'll comment on pretty much everything you do in the game to the point that you'll even
Wait.
get moments like this.
Are you sure you should continue? Maybe we should leave things as they are.
And you're given the choice to actually choose. She'll also do things like
CyberLife, the company that
present
manufactured
you
me,
with
is
surveys, which are
conducting a
framed
user
as being
survey. Would you like
offered
to
by this
participate?
company that exists within the actual narrative of the game. So right on the title screen,
Great.
you're taking these
Let's
surveys,
start.
answering questions, and then eventually you get to see how
Would you
your
consider
answers stack
having a
up against
relationship with
answers
an
from all the other
android that looks
players
like a
who went through
human?
those same surveys. And Chloe does a whole ton of other stuff that we don't have depicted here, similar to like Simpson's Hit and Run. She'll comment on certain holidays based on the system clock. She reacts to pretty much everything you do in the game. And she even has her own narrative arc that sort of occurs right within this title screen. Towards the end of the game, you're even given the option to set her free, let her live autonomously as an android, or to just kind of keep her trapped within the title screen. So it's a really complicated example. I don't know whether or not I can really recommend Detroit Become Human, but it's definitely worth checking out, if not only for this weird and very meta sort of title screen. Next up, we've got Call of Duty Black Ops. Call of Duty, obviously a household name of FPS games. SPF. So this one touches on a lot of interesting concepts. It's set during the Cold War and touches on things like black operations, brainwashing, MK Ultra, mind control. So on the title screen here, it's set in the first person, and you're essentially playing as this character strapped in a chair. The only options you really have are to look around this room at these various monitors, surgical tools, radio waves that are presented before you. And then your actual menu options are visible on one of these CRT displays in front of the character. So ordinarily, your only options here are to really look around or choose which menu option you want to jump into. But there's actually a really interesting Easter egg here where if you mash the trigger buttons, you can break out of this chair and walk around the room that the title screen is set in. So you're no longer bound to this restricted viewpoint. You can actually get up and move around. And you can find this computer terminal, which gives you a keyboard overlay, that lets you type in a bunch of different passwords for various effects. For one thing, which we have depicted here, you can unlock this Dead Ops arcade game, which is just like a sort of retro-style top-down conversion of the basic zombie shooter gameplay that is featured in a lot of the Call of Duty games. But also included is a full port of the 1980 text adventure game Zork. And there's even like a mock-up DOS UI, which has its own file commands that let you type in codes and such to access things like concept art, things of that nature. So there's a lot that you can do just in this one title screen alone. And it's a really interesting example as a result of that.
Moving to a lighter game, we have WarioWare Twisted. We're starting in media res in the Puro minigame, which you can unlock. And in general, this is sort of just a stand-in for the WarioWare series and really any minigame compilation that has title screens within title screens for the minigames. I'll pause it right here so you can see the Puro title screen. So all the minigames that you unlock through completing the main game will have title screens like that, many with their own music and creative aesthetic. But the reason this is here is because the final minigame you unlock in WarioWare Twisted is WarioWare Twisted. And beyond just being very meta in that sense, there's a really interesting Easter egg going back to the boot logos. This is the only occurrence I could think of the like iconic Game Boy boot logo being messed with, and obviously that's just emulated in game because that's a console thing. But if you want, you can go back into your games mode because it just soft resets the game. But you can play WarioWare Twisted within WarioWare Twisted within WarioWare Twisted, and if you like Puro, you're in for a treat if you haven't already played WarioWare Get It Together. Where he's finally playable in the main game. And this background is actually Puro's Game and Wario, which doesn't have anything notable about it other than I really like it, and they just call him Bird. Finally, we have an unintentional example of title screens being really significant in a game. In Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, if you save at a bird statue and die, it'll boot you out to the title screen. But if you say to continue and then hard reset your game, you get this game in this really weird state where you're loaded into the version of the starting area from the start of the game, which has its own bird statue that'll basically let you quick save it a different way than the normal saving system. And the end result is if you get yourself over to this bird statue, the game will remember that you saved at the real bird statue in the game, and then you'll be loaded back into the correct map at the coordinates of the one in this weird glitchy title screen town. And this is used to skip large percentages of the game in the any percent run.
Right. So you're basically simultaneously controlling Link and the title screen at the same time. And this is really the big example we have. This one, forget our panel about title screens. This guy made a game about title screens. So this is Memory Leak. It was part of a game jam developed by Piscopat39. And we'll just kind of let this play out a bit because it should become pretty clear what's happening here. So the start button seems kind of glitchy. Eventually you have a little player character fall in here and you realize you can do some platforming. And then the title screen elements themselves start becoming platforms that you can interact with. So the start button itself keeps moving further and further away. Your goal is ostensibly to reach the start button and hope that it actually starts what the game must be. And you have all these UI elements which function as they would on the main menu, on the title screen, but also start acting as platforms. So while they retain their function, aesthetically, the quit button has this little yes, no, check mark slider pop out. They also become platforms. And the options one here is really interesting. The music slider still functions while also acting as an elevator and a platform for you to get up. So this is a really short game. Again, it was just part of a little game jam. We both definitely recommend you go out and just give this a shot. But of all the categories and all the examples that we've had so far, this is definitely, I think, the trippiest example that we've been able to find of a game that does something unique with its title screen, and the fact that the title screen itself is the full game.
And I think that brings us to...
Game over, yeah!
Yeah, so that's pretty much it.
We're just about out of time, but I will go to our first honorable mention slide. This one. All right, so honorable mention, Metroid Dread. As you progress through the game, it becomes clear that the final boss of the game is actually Samus's father, and the title screen changes to be Metroid Dad. It doesn't actually do that, but wouldn't it be cool if it did?
In another world.
And
So-
there's my plugs if you're interested. And now, if anyone has any burning examples of great title screens we didn't get to, we have 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yeah. What does that one do? What's unique about the title screen?
You play through the first section of the game, and then you reach the part where you discover a cube which shatters, and then the game resets itself, and then it goes through like a boot sequence, as if you were like starting a computer, and then it goes to the title screen again, and then it's all like glitchy.
Oh, yeah. It's been so long since I played through Fez. Yeah, that's a good example. Thank you. We'll take note of that one. Anybody else got anything? Yeah, what you got? Yeah, our format is pretty much always pick out one thing from a game, be it a mechanic, a concept, any kind of, singular element, find as many examples as we can, and then just do this.
Yeah, when we were researching, I was actually really surprised how few games had you play with the opening developer logos, because I had in my head oh, that's something that happens all the time, but it's almost always credits of Smash Brothers or Monkey Ball so yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Is it the facial stubble?
No, it's part of the game where you get killed in the cutscene. And it gets sent you back to the menu and opens.
Yeah, we were discussing including that one actually. I don't think we got the video for it, but yeah, Sandman's drugged you up and it makes you think your console crashes and stuff. That's a really cool one.
Yeah, Arkham Asylum was on our list, but it was one of the things that we just had to end up cutting to meet time. There were so many things that we ended up having to cut. There's so many cool title screens. Yeah, what you got? No, that's actually something we were considering.
Yeah, probably going to be our next one.
Yeah. There's a lot of fascinating stuff with loading screens, too, because I think there's a company that owns like a patent on playable loading screens. I forget if that's like Capcom or who that is, but yeah, it might be Namco. Yeah. So basically, playable loading screens are patented, which kind of limits our options there. But even then, there's still a ton of novel, interesting loading screens that at least give you something cool visually to look at. And even prior to that patent, there were plenty of interactive ones too. So thank you.
That's like almost a modern transition of the title screen, in that as games got easier to just like suspend from any point in game, loading from map to map started taking a really long time.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
It'd be interesting to pinpoint how many good examples of that there are. And
anybody else? All right. Well, I guess we'll call it. Thank you so much for coming out. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.